What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So I've officially 100%ed the achievement lists for all 6 of the Final Fantasy Pixel Remasters, and it is time for me finally to talk about Final Fantasy VI. My desire to replay FF6 was a major reason as to why I went through the previous 5 games leading up to this. Sure, I could have jumped into FF6 just on its own and then jumped into the various other Pixel Remasters as I felt like it, but I think working my way up from the first game to this one made this playthrough feel a lot more earned. This game is definitely my recommendation if you only want to play one of these first 6 titles, via the Pixel Remasters or otherwise, though there's definitely enjoyment to be had with some of the earlier titles as well. I do want to say up front that I will be spoiling this 30-year-old game. I'm not going to tell you what to do. If you don't care about spoilers or you want or need to hear more to be convinced, then feel free to stick around, of course. I will still give a verbal warning as to when I get into deep spoilers, but I do think, as with most games that are very narrative focused, it is probably best to experience them as blind as possible. This is my second time playing through Final Fantasy VI in full. It was during the early months of 2020 that I initially decided to delve into some of the older Final Fantasy titles, which I hadn't played since, as I've stated many times in the past, my first video game console was an N64, and I kind of stuck with Nintendo through my formative years, and it wouldn't really be until my late teens that I would really start dabbling outside of that ecosystem. And even though some of these titles were on Game Boy Advance or the Wii Virtual Console, etc. and so on, for whatever reason I just never went out of my way to play them growing up. So of course 2020 was kind of the perfect time to dig into various video game series that I had not been super familiar with prior, even though I had heard plenty about the Final Fantasy series through the grapevine and delving into various forums and whatnot. I do kind of want to do a Final Fantasy 1 through 9 tier list at some point to not only kind of give my ranking and perspective on these games, but also maybe delve into certain aspects that I wasn't able to or didn't in my various dedicated videos on most of these games. But now that all of the introductory stuff is out of the way, let's pivot into story talk to start. And the first thing I want to say about the story in Final Fantasy VI is that the tone that this game sets is pretty much perfect, or at the very least what I am looking for when it comes to the vibe of Final Fantasy. I feel like 4 is a little overly serious at times, to the point of feeling a little stilted and stiff, especially when it comes to its characterization. And then 5 kind of leans a little bit too much in the opposite direction, where it's a little bit too silly at times, for my taste at least. And I think 6 kind of strikes that balance right in the middle. It definitely leans more on the serious side than the lighter side for sure, but it's able to kind of weave between the two in a way that I don't think the previous 2 games fully executed on. And I think FF6 nailed this tone so well that there were many scenes throughout this playthrough that gave me goosebumps, which can't really be said for the previous games, at least to this extent. Although there are still some moments here and there in the story that do lack impact to the degree that I think was trying to be presented due to the limited presentation of this being a pixel art title for the Super Nintendo back in the 90s. I'd say that probably 9 times out of 10 this isn't an issue for me, but in those 1 out of 10 instances I felt like I was left wanting more as far as explicitly showing what was actually happening. What I mean by this is a lot of older games had hardware limitations as far as presentation is concerned, for sure. And I'm not just talking graphics, like resolution. That's the less important factor to me. The more important factor to me is animation. The character models in FF6 are proportioned a little more realistically. They're not as squat, and therefore they're able to express a little bit more with different poses and facial expressions and whatnot. Sure, it is a little over the top to try to convey that to the audience. It very much is like theater or a performance in a sense. I'm not an actor, but I am a musician. So this does apply in circumstances where when you're on stage, you kind of need to overdo your movements and expressions to convey that to the audience. And this both goes physically and even musically to an extent. Depending on what kind of space you're playing in, it's going to affect the way that the music is conveyed to the people in front of you. And in this particular case, it's not a live performance, but you can almost think of the hardware limitations of the Super Nintendo being kind of that barrier between performer, quote unquote, and audience. The other element to this is because of said limitations, you can almost view a lot of these early narrative-centric titles, which were mainly in the RPG genre, as being sort of abstractions or representations of something grander. Like, for instance, when you're walking from Narshe to Figaro Castle, it's not literally like a 5-minute walk. The world map in a lot of these locations are shrunk down to make for a better gameplay experience, as opposed to being fully realistic in that sense. I'm not saying that that particular aspect is what takes me out of things, but it's more so, I think, action sequences, which is going to bring me into pretty heavy spoilers, so this is your verbal warning if you don't want any spoilers. The big one for me is when Kefka kills General Leo. I seem to remember Kefka physically stabbing Leo. That's kind of how I pictured it, and this time around actually seeing it again, it was not nearly that explicit. And I'm not saying that I necessarily need there to be blood and gore being represented in a pixel art game, but it is something that makes Kefka in this instance feel maybe not quite as threatening as he is made out to be, or as I think he is presented earlier on when he's poisoning the citizens of Doma, for instance. That scene was just as awesome as I remembered it being, and that's one of those where they do a lot with a little, as far as the various soldiers and citizens of Doma dying from the poisoned river. I don't want to harp on this point too much when it comes to FF6 in particular, because I do think this game does a far above average job of overcoming these limitations. It's more so for older, or at the very least older styled RPGs, generally speaking. I'll also say that the writing in this version of FF6, which as far as I understand is different from the original US release. I think when I played this originally, it was the patched Ted Woolsey uncensored translation or something. I don't remember exactly the distinct differences, but I didn't really have many problems with the writing here. Again, I think that it struck a good balance between being serious, being how people would actually be talking in these situations, as opposed to being very stiff. It also wasn't overly comedic or undercut by weird fourth wall breaks or pop culture references or like whatever was going on here and there in FF5. A big narrative factor that strikes me about this game is its story setup. It gives you a little bit of backstory, a little bit of history as far as the War of the Magi that had taken place long before the game's events. Magic is kind of this lost power and has thought to have been long gone. But then, of course, as you see in the opening scenes, the Empire under Emperor Gestalt has developed a form of technology based around magic, and of course Kefka being the court mage for the Empire was a big part of that. I like how later on you get Sid's involvement, where he was very much on the engineering side of things, whereas Kefka was more on the magical side of things, and they kind of cooperated to make Magitech. But contrary to Kefka, who shows no remorse and is just purely chaotic evil, Sid actually shows great remorse as far as what he did, and especially in the way that it impacted Celis, who I think he mentions he raised like his own daughter. Celis is one of the few who is able to wield magic, likely through some form of experimentation and or torture maybe, and that is much more apparent when it comes to Terra, the first playable character you're given access to in Final Fantasy VI, who I think is intended to be the main character. I mean, she is the figure in the Magitech armor that is on the box art, and is also a huge focal point narratively, since she kind of serves as a bridge between the human world and the Esper world. I don't know that FF6 in its current state presents Terra as being the main character super clearly, especially because it is an ensemble cast, and there are other characters who are given just as much limelight as Terra, if not debatably more. But before I get too in the weeds on characters, let's dial it back and talk a bit about the world of Final Fantasy VI. So in addition to the story and kind of lore setup for this game, I really like a lot of the locations here as well. Narshe is extremely memorable as a first location, and that's kind of only solidified since you just kind of get a glimpse of it. You're invading, essentially, at the very beginning, and it's not until you come back later, and some of your characters gain forgiveness for their previous actions, that you're able to explore it fully. Of course, you have Figaro Castle, which leans into the technology side of things, where it can bury itself in the sand and then move locations, which is super sick. Zozo, of course, is a very memorable location, leaping between these apartment buildings or whatever they're supposed to be. The Opera House, of course. The aforementioned Magitech Factory, the Esper World, Floating Continent. Like, there's just so many cool and memorable locations in this game. And that can also be said for some of the prior titles, but it's just something that really sticks out and resonates with me for whatever reason. But in a broader sense, Final Fantasy VI divides its content in a way that made the 100% process much more bearable than my experience with FF5. Primarily by having fewer missables, since many hidden items and chests can be acquired in either the World of Balance or the World of Ruin, in addition to the vast majority of locations being marked on your map outright, and so it's pretty easy to see what you may or may not have missed as far as locations are concerned. I know that wouldn't always make sense in the previous games, but this is something that, at least from a completion standpoint, I really appreciated. This game took me pretty much exactly 40 hours, according to the Steam playtime tracker at the very least. There were some segments that I had to go back and replay because I had missed a specific bestiary entry that only shows up in a specific location during a specific story segment, which was kind of a bummer. But the big takeaway when it comes to spending 40 hours on this game is I didn't really mind it taking that long. Sure, there were some achievements like getting Setzer's Lucky Sevens and finding certain rare encounters that were annoying, but never came close to how I was feeling while 100%ing FF5, despite that game only taking me about 30 hours by comparison. And that's not necessarily an indictment on FF5. I've said previously that I do think that 100%ing that game in particular did sour sour my experience with it a bit, to the point where I think following playthroughs will be more enjoyable. Whereas with FF6, I actually feel sort of the opposite. Sure, in following playthroughs, there are some things I probably wouldn't bother with, like filling out the bestiary, for instance, which does carry over playthrough to playthrough. But most, if not everything else, did kind of just add to the experience, because a lot of these quote-unquote optional locations are, first of all, in the World of Ruin, and second of all, if you were to skip them, I feel like you'd be missing out on some major character and story context that I'm glad I did this time around, because I definitely didn't do everything in my previous playthrough. And so let's dig into the differences between the World of Balance and World of Ruin a little bit, and not just the general restructuring of locations, but how they're kind of handled from a game design standpoint. So the World of Balance is the most story-heavy portion of the game, and by virtue of that is very linear also. There are times that the game allows you to explore, but you are very much intended to go from one place to the next to the next. And of course you do have the splitting scenario pretty early on between Terra and Sabin. And yeah, I guess that is technically non-linear, but other than that, the structure of the World of Balance is linear, very narrative focused, and you have a set party for the vast majority of it. And in those times that allows you to explore, your party is flexible, but I'd say you actually want to bring certain characters anyway for the extra optional scenes that you get between Edgar and Sabin, for instance, at the castle, or Celis and Locke when Locke goes to visit Rachel. And there are some others here and there that are contextual based on who you have in your party. But this is something that bothers me about older JRPGs in particular, that kind of ties into what I was saying earlier about the limitations and all that. Having hidden scenes like this is cool. It definitely adds to the sense of mystery and wonder, but in most cases I would almost rather the characters who are relevant to these scenes be mandatory so that they're present for these scenes to happen, because I think they are that important for certain characters especially. And the thing that bothers me about this is that if you don't have these characters in your party, then you just totally miss out on all that context. And even if these characters aren't forced into your party for combat necessarily, they should at least tag along to some degree, even if they're not participating in combat, so that way the player doesn't miss out on these scenes that I don't think should be optional by and large. Contrary to the World of Balance, we have the World of Ruin, which trades linearity for freedom, but at the cost of trading the much more narrative focus for something a little bit more sparse, and a lot of moments that you do need to go out of your way for, similar to what I was just talking about with those optional scenes with certain party members. To me, this is less egregious in the World of Ruin because of how free it is, and it's not like you go visit a location without a certain character in your party and the event happens differently. It just doesn't happen at all, right? If you don't take Cyan or Cayenne, or however you want to pronounce it, to Doma Castle to do the Dreamscape sequence, then it just won't trigger. As different than in the World of Balance being forced to go to Figaro Castle, but if you don't have Edgar and Sabin, you still progress to the next event. You just miss out entirely on the backstory between them, basically. And so yeah, the World of Ruin is more or less non-linear. I think it's kind of cool that you can go pretty much straight to the final dungeon, at least after recruiting Edgar and Setzer. I would definitely advise against this, but it technically is an option, which is a very cool thing. Like, Kefka won and is just kind of resting on his laurels and is seemingly kind of just bored with being all-powerful, which kind of speaks to this game's message, which for me, the major takeaway is the adversity that we face in life is what makes it interesting, and overcoming said adversity is what allows us to grow as people and find something to fight for or live for, but also kind of taking solace in the mundane, which Kefka obviously fails to do since he's all about sowing chaos in the world of FF6. But back to the World of Ruin itself, I know I keep getting sidetracked, but there's just a lot to talk about with this game, and it's mostly a freeform discussion anyway. So even though the story beats in the World of Ruin are sparse and optional to a large degree, it allows for this portion of the game to heavily focus on exploration and dungeon crawling, which the World of Balance really didn't have much of by comparison. And that's not something that I really had thought about prior to this playthrough, that the World of Balance is kind of lacking when it comes to dungeons. It's fine because it does make up for it with the narrative focus, but I really enjoyed a lot of the dungeons in the World of Ruin, several of which involve controlling multiple parties of characters, which is an element that is actually foreshadowed a little bit in the World of Balance with those defend kind of missions where you position multiple parties to block oncoming enemies. Although let's be honest, you kind of just want to bum rush all of them with a singular party to get as much experience as possible, so that way you can take on the boss easier, especially because a lot of these enemies move really slow. That's one gameplay aspect that I don't think is like that great, but I guess as a preface to these dungeons later on that require you to swap between different parties, it's a decent little teaser and kind of introduction to that mechanic. But yeah, this time around, especially since I was going out of my way to do as much as possible in the World of Ruin, I felt that shift from the very narrative-driven World of Balance to this much more gameplay-driven segment. And despite the story content in the World of Ruin being much more sparse, I do like what is present, especially because much of it serves the purpose of wrapping up various character arcs. Which brings me into the characters of Final Fantasy VI, at least a little bit more deeply. Final Fantasy VI famously has a huge cast of party members to choose from, 14 total. And we could potentially have another Kate Sith scenario on our hands with some of these pronunciations, so bear with me and forgive any oddities with how I might pronounce some of these characters. I have no issue defaulting to whatever voice-acted pronunciations may be present at a later date. I kind of have begun to view FF6's cast as being split between the core main cast, which I would say are Terra, Locke, and Celis for sure, and then Edgar, Setzer, and Shadow would probably also be in that group, primarily for Edgar's nobility and connections, Setzer's airship, of course, and Shadow actually proves to be pretty pivotal despite being an optional character, especially when he jumps in to try to stop Kefka from disrupting the Warring Triad. The second group of characters I would deem as being more of a supporting role, and maybe heavily story relevant at times, but not for the entire duration of the game, being Sabin, Cyan, again however you want to pronounce it, Gao, Strago, and Realm. And you could even maybe argue some of these characters would fall into this last category, which would be characters who are clearly just here to fill a certain role for gameplay purposes, being Mog, who is kind of the party dancer, Gogo, who is the mime, and Umaro, who is the berserker. So kind of bringing in some of those missing jobs from Final Fantasy V, since every character is a set job in FF6. Overall, while I would prefer to have a smaller cast that are each explored extremely thoroughly, I do think FF6 gives plenty of shine to its most relevant characters. It definitely does feel like characterization is spread thin at times, but while most of the character arcs here are fairly simple, I still find them to be very effective. Again, doing a lot with a little. A lot of the moments where I was most captivated, in fact, were the character resolutions in the World of Ruin, which people like to criticize for lacking in story content. And I'm not going to sit here and say that you're necessarily wrong for thinking that, because it kind of just is true. There is less story content in the World of Ruin than in the World of Balance, and you do have to seek it out. But overall, I feel like the story content in the World of Ruin kept up that same level of quality, despite being, say it with me now, much more sparse and optional by technicality. See, I don't necessarily blame people for not resonating with this game as much following the World of Balance and feeling like certain character arcs fall off a cliff, which is maybe a poor choice of words with this particular game, but I don't know, I think within a modern context, I definitely would prefer if these character and story threads were more overt and kind of threaded more directly between the World of Balance and World of Ruin, maybe even with more setup in the World of Balance for certain characters, where it almost feels like you're kind of dumped their entire backstory and resolution at once in the World of Ruin. As far as I understand, the World of Ruin, at least in its current form, wasn't originally planned to be a part of FF6. I don't know to what extent that is true, but it's something that I've heard over the years, and it's interesting because I don't think that this game would be nearly as strong as a whole if you were to remove the World of Ruin from it. So I'm very glad that Final Fantasy VI exists in the state that it is in. Because if this game were to end after the World of Balance, sure, certain story threads wouldn't kind of flow in the wind until eventually finding something to reattach to, but I feel like as a gameplay experience, I would find this game to be much more lacking if you didn't have those dungeons and additional espers and whatnot to explore and find. Which brings me, of course, into the gameplay side of Final Fantasy VI. As far as I can tell, ATB was altered slightly in this game, primarily that the ATB meter actually keeps moving during attack and spell animations, whereas in the previous ATB games, being 4 and 5, the ATB meter would actually stop whenever a character would actually perform an action. Now, the ATB meter in FF6 is definitely slower to make up for this, but the flow of battle is so much better because the meter doesn't stop constantly, and leads to this game's combat feeling much more active than several other ATB Final Fantasies because of this, even playing on wait mode, as I typically do, which is something that I may actually stray away from. Another thing to note about ATB in this game is that in previous versions, the battle speed setting only applied to the enemy side of the field, I guess functioning as somewhat of a difficulty toggle. I always found this weird, but as far as I can tell, this is no longer the case in the Pixel Remaster version specifically, which in my opinion is a good thing. You can mess with the difficulty via the experience boosters anyway, so I don't really feel like much is lost. Something that I haven't mentioned thus far, but has been present since, I think, the original Final Fantasy, in fact, is the row system. So having characters on the front row or the back row. I think the main reason I haven't mentioned it is because usually you just set your ranged attackers in the back and then your more direct physical attackers in the front, because being on the back row doesn't affect ranged attacks such as magic or bow and arrow. And in FF6's case, as far as I'm aware, many of the character's special abilities also aren't affected. In previous games, it was kind of a set and forget. Of course, in FF4, you have the rotating party, so you do need to mess with that a little bit more. And because in FF4, you can't just have anyone be on the front or back row. It's always alternating between front and back. So you either have 2 in front, 3 in back, or 3 in front, 2 in back. In the other 5, you can just pick what row each individual is on, independent from the others. This does sometimes present some interesting scenarios. If you get ambushed by the enemy and it's a back attack, your row setup is actually flipped. If you get ambushed and you're surrounded, you could potentially be on the front or back row just kind of relative to whatever enemy is targeting you from either side. And also, if you get an ambush on an enemy and it's a side attack in that case, then they're the ones in the middle. And so the row setup could be different depending on who's on what side. And yeah, there may be times where certain bosses, in particular in these games, will pull you forward to try to, you know, make your ranged attackers, who are typically more frail, vulnerable. But largely it is still very much a set and forget. And in FF6's case, because so many of these characters have special abilities that aren't affected by row, you kind of just want them on the back row at all times, which kind of undermines the whole system in my opinion. It's not really a particularly deep system to begin with, so I don't mean to harp on it too much, but this brings me into something that begins to plague Final Fantasy at this point, though to a much greater degree in FF7 and 8 for sure, being character homogenization, or if you want the dictionary definition, the process of making things uniform or similar. FF6 kind of skirts around this with the specific abilities, right? Only Sabin can use Blitz, only Cyan can use Bushido, only Mog can use dances, etc. and so on, which I think is the main element that prevents these characters from feeling overly similar. Though in a lot of cases, the best move for many of these characters is to kind of just spam whatever their most powerful Blitz or Bushido or tool in Edgar's case. It can make the battles feel overly automated, especially the further you get. And you add to this the way that the Esper system works, with every character being able to equip every Esper and therefore being capable of learning every spell, you get dangerously close to that FF7 and 8 scenario where each party member lacks a gameplay identity outside of limit breaks, which in this game's case, there is something equivalent to limit breaks, but they're just very rare. I think it's more akin to FF8 where you need to be very low health. I guess it's kind of a double-edged sword here where the characters in FF6 do permanently learn these spells from the Espers, in addition to many of the Espers granting bonuses to certain stats on level up when they're equipped, which does allow you to have some agency in how you build each of your party members in a way that permanently alters them. But it's also because every character in FF6 can learn every spell that it makes a lot of these abilities feel much less unique and special. Early on, prior to getting access to the Espers, which actually does take quite a while, Terra and Celis kind of serve a very unique role being your only magic casters. But you know, as Syndrome said in The Incredibles, once everyone's super, no one is. And so once everyone has every spell at their disposal, it doesn't feel special anymore, even if a lot of characters want to stick to their specific abilities anyway. Even if technically using Ultima would be better in certain cases, I typically just opted to not do that for most characters in order to keep some semblance of identity. But yeah, generally I just didn't find a ton of incentive to experiment. I kind of just opted to give characters some more useful utility spells in the off chance that I was using them for whatever reason. Pretty much everyone was a dedicated healer, which is kind of anticlimactic as well. And just to talk briefly about the way I used the boosters in this game, I actually had the EXP booster set to 0.5 times for a steeper challenge early on. However, because there was an achievement for leveling all 14 characters up to level 50, I did periodically grind in instances where I maybe otherwise wouldn't have later on in the World of Balance and even throughout the World of Ruin. It is possible that I was over leveled for certain things, although for the final boss my party was pretty much all level 50. I had a couple of 51s for when I fought the enemy that gives you the Bahamut summon, because he leads off with level 5 death. I probably should have fought him with level 49s instead, but whatever. So yeah, on following playthroughs I maybe would approach this differently and actually be somewhat underleveled for longer, although the magic AP booster I kept at 4 times pretty much the whole way through. Even with that maxed out, it could take a while, like a good bit of grinding to learn some spells from certain Espers, especially Ultima and the like. Something that I was kind of getting into and that I've seen a lot of criticism for in FF6 is that since everyone can learn Ultima, the game eventually boils down to just spamming that. And just to push back on this point a little bit, you do get Ragnarok pretty late in the game, and it takes a good amount of grinding for even one character to learn it with the booster maxed, as I was saying. That this criticism doesn't, I think, ring as true as some people make it out to be in practice. However, many of the endgame battles do end up boiling down to spamming your most powerful abilities, which on the one hand does feel earned because you went out of your way to get these optional Espers and do these optional dungeons and put in the work, I guess, quote unquote, to grind these spells out to even have access to them to begin with. But it definitely does undermine the potential for a lot of these late game boss fights, since the strategy, if you want to call it that, I guess, was generally cast Hastka on the party, spam Ultima, spam Phantom Rush, heal when necessary, and that's pretty much it. Like, that final boss is still a great spectacle and sets an amazing tone, but it did feel, from a gameplay aspect, anticlimactic because these late game abilities are so powerful. And I didn't mention like equipping relics. You've got your 4 gear slots, right? Your 2 hands, head, and body, and then the relics have various different effects, be it the Genji glove, which allows you to equip a weapon in each hand as opposed to having to do a weapon and shield, ones that give immunity to status, ones that auto cast certain spells under certain conditions, etc., etc. I think it's a cool system and provides another layer of customization there, though I may be a little bit too aware of what the best setups are for certain characters, like actually buffing Sabin's magic for the inevitable Phantom Rush, keeping Locke as a physical damage dealer, and so the Genji glove is kind of a no-brainer for him, etc. and so on. And so yes, the Espers do homogenize these characters to an extent, but they are kept individualized by these different equipment setups and by these different special abilities that only they can use, though it almost leans a little bit too far in that other direction where there's not really much incentive to experiment beyond just using your most powerful ability at any given time, unless you're low on health or status or something. But despite all that, I did still find the way that the gameplay systems work in this game to be satisfying. In future playthroughs, when I'm not going for 100% completion, I could see myself adjusting the boosters to actually limit myself a little bit more, which I don't think is a great argument for games being balanced too much on the easy side, but it is also an option that I know a lot of players, including myself at times, enjoy taking part in. To an extent, I do think that certain challenge runs can go a little bit too far to where you're kind of stripping away what makes these games fun in the first place. And I guess to briefly touch on all the FF6 remake kind of discussion that's been happening somewhat recently, I'm kind of several minds when it comes to this. I think the original game still stands on its own perfectly fine. I think is very much worth playing, because I would say that the pros far outweigh the cons in my mind, and I feel like this game is greater than the sum of its parts, some of which do warrant criticism, even as someone who loved replaying this game. But when it comes to an FF6 remake, part of me does think that an HD 2D styled remake, with enemies being more animated and environments being more fully realized and having literal depth to them instead of just being kind of a flat presentation, at least in the overworld, adding in voice acting, of course, and ideally fleshing out the animations and whatnot to a point where people like me don't feel like there is anything lacking from a story presentation standpoint. And so part of me does think that that would be enough. And while I would be curious to see FF6 be realized to a much grander degree, I just don't know how feasible or realistic that type of project would actually be. If you were to go completely hog wild with it, then yes, many of the characters should get more fleshed out, backstories and personalities and all of that kind of stuff. And you would kind of have to do the same for even the most superfluous characters here, though I do think you could potentially do that in the HD 2D style as well. But the main reason why I wanted to talk about this is because regardless if a remake ends up happening or what style it ends up being in, I do think that there should definitely be gameplay adjustments, even if it is still ATB. Obviously, if they were going to go full-fledged 3D remake, I would bet that it would be some kind of hybrid system similar to the 7 remake series that's been going on, which is perfectly fine with me, because I think that gameplay style slaps. But if it were HD 2D, it would undoubtedly stick to the more traditional ATB style, which is also fine. But I do think things need to be balanced a little bit better. I don't know if limiting certain characters from being able to use certain espers or certain spells would be the answer. I think that's one possible solution. I think cranking up enemy health pools in the late/end game would also help immensely, especially for the final boss fight. Maybe even having some of these bosses be able to be immune to or ban the use of certain spells under certain conditions or something. Sure, I guess that does undermine the effort it might take to acquire Ultima if Kefka just snaps his fingers and says nope, but at the same time, it makes for a more interesting gameplay experience. So balancing games in this fashion, especially ones that are this flexible, is a tricky thing to achieve. You want the player to feel powerful, but as a player, I also don't want to just steamroll everything either. The final dungeon, as cool as it is, as far as jumping between 3 different parties and them fighting different bosses, it just didn't really prove to matter that much because I had enough powerful shit at my disposal to spread across those 3 parties to where you're basically nuking everything, which is fun in its own right. My overall thoughts on Final Fantasy VI, though, it's an easy contender for my favorite Final Fantasy game currently. Of course, what's next for me as someone who's already played FF7, 8, and 9 is moving on to Final Fantasy X, which I actually did play a good maybe 5 or so hours of a few years ago, but kind of fell off of it. That will very likely be the next Final Fantasy game I play, though I am, at the time of this recording at least, taking a bit of a break from Final Fantasy. Since I did more or less play these 6 Pixel Remasters back to back, I need a little bit of a breather before diving back in, and I do ultimately plan to play all of the remaining single-player Final Fantasies that I have not played yet, at which point then we'll see about going into the MMO side of things. But yeah, I say all this because, barring the aforementioned tier list, it might be a while before I post another Final Fantasy video on the channel, but rest assured there are other RPG series that I'm continuing to make my way through and or am looking to delve into for the first time, so keep an eye out for that. Of course, I want to thank my channel members and shout out the Space Cowboy at the Super Shadow Operative tier. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, of course, if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.